that piece between your upland and your lowland or lake area is perfect for me because it is where the land and the water meet, and that's where I currently work. I have hopped around a little bit, and I think you kind of have to in this region, in order to stay in Mercer. You kind of got to hop through the variety of different jobs out there in the natural resources field. I've worked for the Iron County Department, the Conservation Department, for 2 years now, and I come to the department with an education background. I worked as a naturalist for the North Lakeland Discovery Center and teaching all ages. And tonight, rather than give you another boring PowerPoint presentation that you couldn't see anyway with the sun shining in, I brought a whole slew of different things for you. I know some of you in the back, you probably were those students that didn't sit in the front row, and you probably will daze off in about 5 minutes anyway. And if you go to the other meetings that are held tonight, I don't mind, that's okay. But I may have to come around and show you some of these specimens, or you can move forward, because I brought some of the most fascinating creatures that we have up here that live in that buffer zone for you to see and enjoy. Because the stuff we just heard about, policy, politics, bills, things that may or may not be, most likely they're not in our control. We can try, we can vote, but what is in your control is what you do on your land. And I think that's where we have to take this next step. Yes, they've changed the policies and the laws. You now can have, it's not 35-foot buffer, it's 35% buffer. So if you have a 200-foot shoreline, you can do a 70-foot buffer in that one viewing corridor. I'm sorry, a 70-foot viewing corridor. It's confusing, but you don't have to do it. And that's kind of my message tonight. Yes, the laws have changed, but we don't have to abide by them. We can do better. We have to abide by the 35-foot buffer per 100 feet of your shoreline. But you could do 30, you could do 20, you could do 10, you could do no viewing corridor if you wanted. And the power lies with you. Why do we live on a lake? Most of us live on a lake so we can see it. And we understand that reality. But the definition describes a buffer zone. Again, that land between, or that piece between our upland and our lake, as a shield, as a place of protection, a cushion to protect something. And I think of, when I read that definition, I thought, this shouldn't be a shield. This shouldn't be a scary thing, the word buffer. This should be renamed. In fact, I'm going to advocate for us to change the word from buffer to wild or living wildlife corridor, or something more positive, because that little strip that is a huge filter for our lakes is so important, and we shouldn't think of it as this negative thing that blocks our view of the water. It's an incredibly important part of our lake. And I did our presentation this summer for the annual meeting, the state of the county's lake and river, and my report was, we look pretty good here in Iron County. As far as I see, a lot of folks understand what a buffer is, and they understand the importance of it and how they need to maintain some kind of wildlife and filter to our lakes. And I think we're doing pretty good in this county, but land turns over so often, and some folks that move up here don't maybe get the Iron County idea of leaving our shorelines natural. And the law says they can do these things. They can remove shoreline buffers. And so what I'm here for you tonight is to try to get you to appreciate the wildness of that shoreline, active, living environment, and encourage you to maintain it, restore it, and use it, love it, take the kids and the grandkids down to it, because life in there, in that buffer, is so important for the health of our lakes. And I know many of you know this, and I don't want to beat an old drum here, but for those of you that are learning about nature, and especially the northern part of this state and how diverse it is, I think you'll enjoy some of the things I have to share. Other things that I'm going to call it a buffer until we create something, a better term for it tonight. That's our goal for tonight, is a new term for that buffer, so to speak. But it does some other things. For example, it filters sediment and phosphorus and nitrogen and things that run off the landscape down to the water. And if we didn't have a way for that water to slow down, our lakes would turn green with phosphorus and chlorophyll, algae. Our shorelines would erode. Our lakes would turn from this nice, clear, cool water system into a warm water, eutrophic system with algae and tons of plant growth. And you don't have to go very far to see examples of that. Minocqua, Eagle River, this is the line for us. It's becoming that way in Manitowish waters as well. It's knocking at our door, and we have the power, like I said, to write this. The buffer also is a sound buffer. And when I'm on the lake fishing and enjoying it, or when tourists are here enjoying our lakes, I don't want to hear your arguments between your wife or your husband or your kids. A buffer is a sound buffer. You probably don't want to hear me screaming and yelling when I catch that big 50-inch muskie either. Buffers are so important in that sound area. They're also a sight buffer, and I think we forget about another form of pollution, and that is light pollution. I'm from the Wilson clan, and we're kind of tight in the pocketbook all the time, and so I always yell at the kids when they leave the light on, mostly to save my money, but it's also good for the environment as well. And light pollution is another huge thing that we still have to try to fix. The new laws prevent us from regulating any shoreline lighting zones, ordinances, and that is something still the buffer will help shield or filter. So we've got to think about some of these other things. Buffers are also really important, I mentioned, for slowing down water, but they're important for taking water that's running off of your driveways, or what we call impervious surfaces, and gushing down to our lakes as well. And a lot of times that water runs across your lawn. If you fertilize your lawn, that fertilizer is directly running right into the lake, increasing your plant growth once again, and algae. And so it's critical to holding back and filtering some of that runoff. The other thing, and I'm kind of speaking from the land to the water perspective now, and I think sometimes we forget about the buffer from the water to land perspective. So what is it doing to protect our shorelines? Native vegetation along our shoreline helps slow down wave action. If you had just grass down to the lawn and these new big wakeboard boats come flying through on a regular basis, that constant crashing in to your shoreline will erode it right down, and eventually you'll lose your property, which I'm sure you value. And it may then make your shorelines more shallow, harder to get your boat in. So there's other aspects of maintaining that native shoreline that's so important. I've brought many things up here, one of which I'm sure you guys are wondering what this little model is. And we use it, we call it the ecoscape, and we use it when we teach our children at the Hurley and Mercer schools about the importance of buffers. And after my talk, if you're interested, you can come up here, and this is a great way to represent or replicate a natural system, raining, and where, that didn't work real well, where your runoff of your on-point source pollution kind of eventually ends up, and how represented, the sponge is representing the buffer, and how important a buffer is to kind of holding back some of that runoff. So later on we'll do an example here of the importance of those buffers. And then my favorite part about the buffer, or the active, alive habitat zone, I will think of a better term by the end of the night, and that is the creatures that live amongst them. And to me, that's where I get excited. Being a naturalist, it didn't take me long to go through a couple shorelines. Mostly the turtle flammable flowage was one of my sources, and my yard being the other, to find some of the most unique creatures that we have on the planet. We have right here, and they live, or they're attached to the buffer. Wood debris, or active plants, woody shrubs that dip into the water. Many, many plants and animals live amongst them. And for me, I don't live on the land, or I don't live on the water, but on my land, my little 15 acres of property, I have tried to diversify my property with all of the native plants I can find around. And what that's done is it's brought in bats, bees, butterflies, dragonflies, and many of those things eat the thing my wife hates the most, mosquitoes. And some people have commented in my yard how lack of mosquitoes that we have in the area, and it might be because of the diversity of things that I put in my yard. And I encourage you on your shorelines to do the same. You can either maintain your native or natural shoreline, or you can enhance it for beauty and plant native flowers that might attract a certain butterfly or dragonfly and so forth. So our department has a lot of different programs that we have to help you do that. We have a cost share program. If you have a bad eroded shoreline, we can match 70% of the cost of restoring that shoreline through some of our grants that we have through our department, and I'd be happy to help you design and give you recommendations on some of those plants. So, what did I bring today? This is where I'm going to move around a little bit. Talking about that shoreline area. First of all, the big one. Being the loon capital of the world, what does our shoreline do, a healthy, maintained shoreline, for loons? Obviously, they use that for nesting. Shorelines are critical for a habitat for loons. Those are 2 loon eggs that failed that I have on display here. But loons, in particular, they need a healthy water, a clean water, clean water clarity in order to site feed, and they're critical for our lakes and our natural ecosystem. A few others, I'll go with the big ones right off the bat. And afterwards, please feel free to come up and check some of these out. I told Wendy we're going to have some of the unique creatures, not just the snapping turtle and the painted turtle that you've all seen. Some species that you may have never seen before. She's cringing already. Does anybody know what this is? It's a weird gelatinous, it's not gooey, well, it's a little gooey, but it's kind of hard. It's clear, but it's got all these little specks and spores on it. Is anybody? Somebody's got to know. Never seen?
Never seen it.
A very common sighting in our lakes. This is a bryozoan.
Okay.
This is an animal. And this is a bryozoan colony. And I get calls every year on this creature. What is this giant brain? And this is a small one, by the way. Giant brain-looking thing that's attached to a piece of wood that's on my shoreline. You've seen one before. They can be round. They can mostly round in the when they're maxed out in their growth. This is a small one. I have several. Here's one that's attached to a aquatic plant. Check that out. And a bryozoan is, when you find them on your lake, it is a good thing. It's an example of clean water quality or good water quality. And they need something to attach to in order to grow. So here's your shoreline. Here we're back to that healthy shoreline where there's roots or plants dipping in. I've found them attached to things like sweet gale, which is an upland kind of shrub. Grows right on the edge, and sometimes they'll get so heavy they'll dip over, and the branches will touch the water and they'll attach to it. Bryozoan is an animal, aquatic animal, and this is a colony, so there's thousands attached into this colony, and it can move. It can move centimeters, tiny little creatures. And what it does, it's got these hair. Imagine if you zoomed in with the microscope and you got this little hairy mouth thing sticking out. And what it does is it has these tentacles out there, and when a piece of zooplankton goes by another creature, like a daphnia or a piece of algae, it touches the hairs and it goes and sucks it in. It's a carnivorous, it's an animal. It's got sexual and asexual organs, so it can reproduce if a piece gets broken off. It's a fascinating creature that we have, and there's only a few species of freshwater ones in our area. Bryozoan, or bryozoa, a good example of good water quality, and we have them on many of our lakes up here. I'm glad I stumped some of you. How about this creature right here? One of my favorite. Look at this weird creature. Does anybody know what this is? Come on, it's green. It's got it looks like a coral. It's kind of spongy. You can squeeze it. It's kind of spongy, green, spongy. Anybody know what this is? It's a freshwater sponge. Another live animal. It's an animal, you think of a sponge, right? You think of the ocean. Well, we have them here too. 98% of sponges of the world live in marine environments. 2% live in freshwater, and we have them. It's very common. Once again, very good example of good water quality. A lot of our rivers and streams have them. This was growing all over the shoreline on the turtle flammable flowage. I've seen them on the Manitoush River, most of our lakes, and they need something to attach to. Again, the importance of our shoreline buffers. This animal can break off and attach and form another colony, and it kind of floats through the water column. It's green only because it eats algae and other zooplankton. So the bryozoan and the freshwater sponge, why are they important to our lakes? Yes, they tell us they're healthy. Well, they're important because they're filters. Just like that buffer, they're a filter. They clean our water. They clean algae out of our water. They filter zooplankton and bacteria, sometimes dangerous bacteria it filters and cleans. Very, very cool creatures. They're animals. Another kind of unique, I'm going to go to a plant this time. It's not an animal, but it acts kind of like an animal. This is a plant. You see all the little dark dots on this plant? Well, those are the bladders, and this is common bladderwort. And it is a plant that is not rooted, but rather floating. And it floats. A lot of our kind of quiet lakes seem to have them, but in the back bay of maybe a lake that has a water system, like a river going through it, might have it as well. But a bladderwort is a carnivorous plant. So again, just like that bryozoan, it's got a little clam. It's got a kind of like a mouth, and that mouth is open, and that little Daphnia swims by, or that zooplankton sucks it up. And this bladderwort in particular is black because it is full, like many of you from eating the Pines food tonight. Bladderwort, and it's a really cool plant, again, filtering out our algae, some of our bacteria that live in our lakes, making us a healthy ecosystem. If we removed all of these things, we wouldn't have those devices, those natural devices that help our lakes balance. And then we become things like Mendota, some of our southern lakes that have turned, this time of year, I wouldn't swim in. They're green, they have dangerous algae in them, blue-green algae that's harmful for dogs and humans. We don't want that. We want healthy, cool plants that we can swim among, although my wife would freak out if she touched that with her feet when she's swimming. But we want some of these natural features to maintain in our lakes. Seeing how I'm on the kick of cool things that eat others, I will show you one of my all-time favorites, and many of you have maybe seen this before. Another quiz. Pitcher plant. Oh, you're hiding behind the tree. This is the full-blown pitcher plant. And by the way, for those of you that are mad at me for collecting some of these things, they're going on display at the Discovery Center, and I'm going to make a live terrarium of bog plants, and it actually works pretty well with a grow light, and you can maintain some of these things for a long time. So, the pitcher plant. I'll pass around a dead one. It's a little wet at the bottom, but it's named appropriately because it looks like a pitcher, right? You pour out of it. And this particular pitcher plant obviously is dead and dying, but the alive ones, the active ones, are very cool looking. They're green and red, and they have a sweet scent that it kind of excretes. And what it does is it eats insects and other bacteria and things that fall inside of it. It lives in the bog or wetland shoreline. So when we think of buffers, we think of our shorelines, we can't just think of the upland stuff. We have to think of our wetlands as well. And those wetlands are critical. They act like a sponge during the drought years. They retain water and slowly leak water back into our lakes so we don't drastically crash in our water levels. During the flood years, it holds back and retains water so our shorelines don't blow out from flooding. They're so critical, those wetland, boggy areas in our lakes. And it turns out that those wetland, boggy areas are very poor in nutrients. They're very acidic from all the plant matter and the leaves breaking down. And so much of the water and much of the nutrients that those plants live in, they can't use at all. So all of the plants create an adaptation in order to take nutrients in. This particular plant's adaptation is eating insects. And what happens, and like I said, I'll pass it around, is an insect will smell or see the bright red colors. They'll fly down in there, and they'll start to crawl down in the lip of the pitcher plant, and they'll quickly slide in and have problems getting out because there's hundreds of little hairs in here, and if you put your finger in there and then try to pull them out, you can feel it restrict it. And an insect slides in, and down at the base, there's a sticky solution where it gets stuck, and the insect is trapped, eventually dying and then decomposing, and then the plant's juices in there eventually break it down and use it for nutrients. Amazing creatures. Again, I'll pass this around. There you go. Stick your finger in that lip and feel those little hairs. But afterwards, come check the live ones out. They're just fascinating. You'll notice this long thing sticking out here, and this is what's so cool about nature and how it knows what to do and how to appropriately grow and reproduce. So if you're an insect-eating plant and you need insects to pollinate you, there's a problem here. There's a buffer between us in a way. I use buffer the right way. So what are they going to do? They protrude this long flower way up high away from the killing part of the plant. And so way up high is the flower. And when I grabbed this one, a bee was inside of it, actually. But pretty cool that it's smart enough to say, hey, I got to pollinate myself yet. But, after you're done pollinating, come on down here and check me out. And we'll talk. So a really neat plant here. Another one just to excite you about shoreline buffers and maintaining that natural environment. Another plant that eats insects. And this one is tiny, so you're going to have to come up later and check it out. But it's the sundew. And it's just like a Venus flytrap. So it has this big kind of mouth. It's open, and on each of the kind of surrounding the mouth, we'll think of it as like little fingers. And on each finger is a very sticky dot that looks like a piece of dew in the morning. A little drip of dew. But it's sticky. And so an insect flies down to this beautiful little red flower and gets stuck in its little sticky parts of its fingers, and eventually it closes like a Venus flytrap, consuming the insect and the nutrients. Fascinating creatures. You get the idea. Some of you may know some of this stuff, but I hope to excite you to restore and maintain those natural shorelines because they're cool, right? And other, thinking about some other plants that I just grabbed for educational purposes is the natural beauty of our aquatic plants. This and the importance. Tomorrow is the early goose season. Those of you that like to go hunting, ducks and geese and so forth. This simple plant here changes the canvasback's migration when it's growing. The canvasback duck will change its migration to go to water celery. It's so important in all of life. Swans, ducks, all of these insects also associated with it are critical. We think we understand it all, but I can tell you it's probably a lot more complicated than what I can tell you tonight. But we do know it's critical for many species. Some of our big floating leaf plants, everybody would just look at this thing and say, oh, it's a yellow pond lily, right? Well, it's a spatterdock, which is a different species and a very cool floating plant. The difference between the white pond lily, which many of you see, and you're probably going to say, oh my gosh, it's illegal to pick a pond lily. It's not actually, but don't tell anybody that. Keep them wild and free. But the pond lilies are round, and the spatterdocks have a flat back or a flat edge, and you can check this out later. It's a very cool plant. Moose, deer, muskrats, beaver. It's great shelter for fish. Very important plant along our shoreline. It also acts as a great buffer for wave action. That wakeboard coming through, ripping around. Well, this plant slows down that wave action before it hits your shoreline and erodes your shoreline. It's also critically important for my favorite aquatic creature, and that's dragonflies. And you'll notice on the bottom of this plant here, there's a big clump of eggs. And a lot of people don't realize this, but that plant that's growing next to your dock, here's a better example, is the home or the start of the life cycle of our dragonflies and damselflies. You can see the holes eaten through here. So what happens is, there's an egg right there on the bottom too. What happens is, dragonflies go through, well, let's just start with the adult dragonfly. Flying around, they mate. The female then flies down to a floating aquatic plant such as this pond lily, and takes its tail and makes a little slit, wraps her tail underneath her, and inserts an egg. And that's where the start